If someone in 1860 Louisiana told you that the worst horrors of the South were found on the largest plantations, they would be wrong. Sometimes the darkest nightmares grow in small places, behind weak wooden walls, inside families who look ordinary from the outside. And sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not born in the shadows. They sit at the dinner table. They sleep inside the same house. They smile like husbands and fathers. This is the story of the Delaney Plantation and how one man turned his home into a place so evil that even the Civil War could not erase its memory. Part 1. In 1860, Louisiana simmered with fear and tension. The American Civil War had not yet begun, but the air already felt heavy. Steamboats roared up the Mississippi River, carrying cotton and the smell of sweat. Slave auctions in New Orleans filled the public squares with shouting traders and crying families. Just a few miles away stood the Delaney Plantation, a small 200-acre farm struggling to survive. Unlike the giant estates that dominated the region, the Delaney property was modest. It was not grand or impressive. Its main house leaned slightly to the left, and its paint had begun to peel under the burning southern sun. Yet inside that aging house lived a family who desperately wanted to hold on to their position in Southern society. Clement Delaney was a man of 45 with tired eyes and hands rough from work. He owned only 15 slaves and never had the wealth or power of the great cotton barons. He often worked in the fields beside the enslaved men, something he claimed was a choice, but everyone knew it was a necessity. Money was becoming tight. Trouble was coming. His wife Joanna was 38. She once had golden hair and a bright smile, but years of raising children, managing the house and surviving her husband's unpredictable moods had changed her. She looked older than her age. 3 of her daughters still lived at home. Arlene was 19 with striking blue eyes. Carolyn was 17 and delicate. Frida, at only 15, was full of energy and hope, unaware of the storm building within her own home. The Delaney slaves were mostly born on the property. Tobias, a strong 30-year-old man, served as an informal overseer. Lila, a 25-year-old woman, worked in the big house and saw everything, even things she wished she had not seen. Life on the plantation was never easy, but it was about to become far worse. The trouble began in 1858 when a plague destroyed half the cotton crop. Money disappeared almost overnight. Clement borrowed from wealthy merchants in New Orleans and their interest rates were brutal. But the worst problem was not the debt. It was Clement's growing addiction to gambling. He traveled often to card tables in town and returned late at night with empty pockets and the smell of whiskey on his clothes. He never explained where the money had gone. He did not need to. Joanna could see it in his face. By 1859 creditors were arriving at the plantation asking for payment. They spoke in cold legal language about seizing property and selling land. Some even hinted that the family might be thrown out of their own home. Clement was angry and humiliated. In a desperate attempt to slow the financial collapse, he sold 3 of his strongest slaves. The sale broke the family's spirit and revealed a darker side to Clement. Before, Clement had treated the slaves with a distant, businesslike attitude. He never showed kindness, but he was not overly cruel. Now something shifted. During the sale he examined the slaves with a disturbing level of coldness. He inspected their teeth, muscles and bodies in a way that even experienced slave traders found unsettling. He spoke openly about their reproductive value, their ability to produce future children, their potential to be sold for profit. People noticed the change. Dr. McCormick, the local physician who visited the plantation occasionally, sensed something wrong. Clement had become more withdrawn, more intense. The doctor overheard him asking questions about pregnancy, fertility and what happened legally to a slave child when it was born. These questions were strange and dangerous. Other slave owners whispered that something was off about Clement. His conversations became darker. He asked about breeding farms and how they made enslaved women produce more children. Even hardened men felt uncomfortable around him. Sheriff Mullins, who had known Clement for years, felt uneasy during his visits. Clement avoided eye contact and mumbled excuses about finances and stress. By the winter of 1859 the house felt different. The atmosphere thickened with tension. Joanna found Clement sitting alone in his office late into the night. He studied borrowed law books and slave codes and covered pages with notes that he hid whenever anyone approached. He read about inheritance rights, property laws and the legal status of children. All of it seemed confusing and unnecessary for a simple cotton farmer. Arlene, the eldest daughter, noticed her father looking at her strangely. She described it to her mother as an evaluating stare, as if he were studying her for a purpose she did not understand. Joanna brushed it off but felt a chill inside her chest. She began waking at night with a feeling of dread she could not explain. Lila, the house slave, felt Clement's eyes on her too. He asked her inappropriate questions about her health, her age and her history of pregnancies. He watched the younger slave women as they worked, staring with a disturbing intensity. Meals in the big house became quiet and tense. Clement barely spoke. He scribbled notes while watching his daughters eat, as if he were observing them in some private study rather than sharing a family meal. No one dared question him. The silence grew heavier each day. In January 1860 Clement made a mysterious trip to New Orleans. He returned 3 days later with a leather briefcase full of documents he locked away in his office. He mentioned a man named Beauregard who could help with legal matters, but he offered no details. Soon after, Clement began reorganizing the slave quarters for reasons no one understood. He separated men from women and restricted movement. He installed new locks on doors inside the house, locks that seemed designed to keep people trapped rather than to keep intruders out. By the end of spring the Delaney Plantation felt like a cage. Even the air felt wrong. Dr. McCormick made one final visit and sensed something dark growing in Clement, something dangerous. Sheriff Mullins noticed the slaves looked more frightened than usual. Then came the summer of 1860. The moment when everything crossed a line. The moment when Clement Delaney stepped fully into the darkness. And the family never recovered. If you'd like, I can continue with Part 2, 1,000 words, in the same style. Part 2, the plan that should never have been born. Hook. Some horrors creep into a home slowly. Others burst in like a storm. But the most dangerous kind are the ones built quietly, in the mind of someone who believes he is doing the right thing. Those horrors grow in secret until one day they finally step into the light. That is what happened at Delaney Plantation in the summer of 1860, when a father allowed a single idea to poison his soul and destroy everything around him. Part 2. The summer heat settled over Louisiana like a heavy blanket. The air was thick enough to taste. Even the cicadas seemed to scream louder than usual, as if they sensed something terrible growing on the Delaney land. For Clement Delaney, June of 1860 marked a point he could never return from. His debts, his desperation, and his growing obsession had fused into one single monstrous plan. A plan that twisted the law of the South into something even the most seasoned slave traders would fear to whisper. For months he had studied the old doctrine called partus sequitur ventrum. The rule stated that a child inherited the condition of the mother. If the mother was enslaved, the child would also be enslaved. It did not matter who the father was. The law cared only about the mother. Clement saw a terrible opportunity hidden within that rule. Free mothers produced free babies. But if documents were changed, those babies could be listed as slaves and sold for profit. The thought alone should have disgusted him. Instead, the idea began to rot his mind from within. New Orleans became his hunting ground. In dark corners of the French Quarter he met a man known only as Beauregard. No one knew his real name. No one asked. Beauregard lived above a tavern thick with drink and smoke. His office was cluttered with ink bottles, stolen papers, and forged signatures. For a price he created birth certificates, baptism papers, and property records that looked real enough to fool any sheriff who did not look too closely. Clement paid him $50 for each false document. It was a fortune for a poor farmer, but in his mind it was an investment that would save the plantation. The first time Clement handed over the money, Beauregard smiled with yellow teeth and asked no questions. That silent agreement was the beginning of a path soaked in cruelty. With forged documents now available, Clement turned his attention to the plantation itself. He reorganized the slave quarters with disturbing precision. He called the new rooms special cabins, but there was nothing special about them. They were small isolated spaces built for only one purpose: reproduction. He selected 3 men as breeders. Tobias was the first, strong, obedient, and healthy. The other 2 were chosen for similar reasons. Female slaves were examined like animals at a market. Clement checked their bodies with cold hands and colder eyes. Lila endured the humiliation in silence. The younger slave women trembled when he called their names. He wrote notes about their cycles and their fertility as if he were keeping records of livestock. But the true horror of the plan was not in the cabins or the forged papers. It was in the idea that he intended to force his own daughters into the scheme. Arlene, Carolyn, Frida, girls who had been raised to believe their father would protect them. Now he saw them not as daughters but as resources. He convinced himself that sacrificing their innocence would save the family. He told himself this was heroic, necessary, a duty. Those lies were the only way he could look at himself in the mirror. To prepare for the future, Clement began making subtle changes. He installed new locks on the girls' rooms. He claimed they were for safety, in case of runaway slaves or intruders. He never mentioned that the locks could only be opened from the outside. When Joanna hesitated at the sight of them, he waved off her concerns and accused her of imagining dangers that were not there. The next step came in the form of small glass bottles filled with herbs. Clement visited a local healer named Marie, who sold mixtures believed to improve women's health. She had no idea what he truly wanted. He told her his daughters suffered from irregular cycles and needed their bodies strengthened. Marie believed him and gave him a blend that influenced fertility. Clement fed these herbs to the girls disguised in tea and soup. They drank without knowing what they were swallowing. He then began isolating his daughters. He refused to let them visit neighbors. He restricted their letters. He kept them inside the house as much as possible. He began shaping their world into one where he had total control. Joanna noticed the slow tightening of rules. She saw the way her daughters grew quieter and more fearful, but every time she confronted Clement he attacked her with sharp words. He called her dramatic. He said she was making problems where none existed. The walls seemed to close in on the family. By July the house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a place waiting for disaster. Clement returned from another trip to New Orleans carrying a bag of medical supplies. Bandages, cloth for newborns, herbs for easing childbirth, a book on midwifery. He claimed he was preparing for emergencies in case Dr. McCormick could not arrive quickly. Joanna knew something was wrong. The supplies were too specific and too many. Clement brushed aside her questions and told her all families should be prepared for unexpected events. He had also learned that baby boys and girls could be sold for more than $200, sometimes $300 if they appeared healthy and light-skinned. The idea of profit drove him deeper into his madness. He contacted a trader named Jacques Thibodeau, a man who transported slave children without asking where they came from. Jacques agreed to take any infants Clement produced and move them to markets far from Louisiana. No one would ever link the babies to Delaney Plantation. The girls began to feel the danger even if they did not understand it. Arlene felt watched. Carolyn found new locks on her window. Frida noticed her father studying her with a strange expression she had never seen before. They whispered with one another at night, trying to explain what they sensed. None of them could put it into words. They only knew that something terrible was coming. Lila and the other slaves felt it too. Clement walked among them with a disturbing kind of confidence. He made comments about their bodies that made their stomachs twist. They spoke quietly of their fears when he was not around, but only at night when the house was asleep. In August, Dr. McCormick visited and saw signs of stress in everyone. Arlene's hands shook when she served him tea. Carolyn barely spoke. Frida stared at the floor and avoided eye contact. When he asked Clement about their health, the father answered with a tight smile and vague excuses. The doctor left with a feeling he could not explain and a fear he could not shake. Finally, in September of 1860, Clement decided everything was ready. The documents, the cabins, the slaves, the secrecy, the preparation of his daughters. The house seemed to hold its breath. The horror was about to begin. If you want, I can continue with Part 3, 1,000 words, in the same style. Part 3, the year the house began to scream. Hook. Some places rot from the outside. Others rot from the inside. But the worst kind of rot is the one no one sees. It is the kind that grows behind closed doors, the kind that fills a home with quiet screams that never reach the ears of the world. By late 1860 and early 1861, Delaney Plantation had become a place where suffering lived in every room. And the walls were starting to remember. Part 3. Dr. McCormick left the big house in August 1860 with a heavy heart. The pale faces of the Delaney daughters stayed in his mind long after his visit. Arlene had barely lifted her eyes from the floor. Carolyn seemed ready to faint at any moment. Frida looked so thin that the doctor wondered if she was eating at all. When he tried to ask Clement what was happening, he received only excuses. Clement blamed normal family tensions and dismissed all concerns with a smile that felt unnatural and forced. September arrived with a colder wind than usual. On that wind came the moment Clement had been preparing for. He had everything set in place. Fake documents, hidden rooms, guards positioned at doors, medicines and herbs organized with military order, and justification after justification rehearsed in his mind for the day someone questioned him. He believed he had covered every detail. He believed he had full control. What followed would prove he had become something far worse than desperate. He had become consumed. By October 1860, the true transformation of Delaney Plantation began. Clement called this period the beginning of renewal. Everyone else would later remember it as the beginning of hell. He started with a meeting in the parlor, claiming he wished to speak about family responsibilities. Joanna, although worried, hoped he only wanted to discuss the debts that had been weighing on him. Instead, things took a darker turn. Arlene was the first victim. Clement summoned her to his office early one morning. A cold mist covered the fields outside. The world was silent. Inside the office, Clement sat with his hands folded like a man conducting business. His voice held no warmth as he told his oldest daughter she would be required to help save the family. She did not understand at first. When he explained that she would be forced to produce children with Tobias, she thought she had misheard him. When she realized he meant every word, her scream echoed through the hall. Clement grabbed her arm and pushed her into her room, turning the key with finality. He told her she would remain locked inside until she agreed. Arlene resisted for 3 long days. She cried until her voice broke. She begged through the door for freedom, for mercy, for anyone to help her. Clement visited her often with a bowl of water and a piece of bread, speaking calmly about duty while showing her documents of the family debts. He threatened her with violence, then changed tone and pleaded with her as if he were the victim. The emotional confusion broke her more than the hunger did. By the end of the 3rd day Arlene no longer cried. Her voice became flat. She nodded once when he asked if she understood her role. Next came Carolyn. The news shattered her instantly. She collapsed on the floor and cried in a way that sounded like a wounded animal. She begged him not to do this. She held onto the leg of his coat and begged him to remember she was his daughter. Clement stepped away from her with impatience. Her tears irritated him. He told her the decision was final. Frida reacted differently. She stood tall and fearless for a moment. She told him she would rather die. Clement did not shout. He simply leaned close and whispered that she could be forced. That she had no power. That every door was locked and every path out of the plantation was guarded. Her courage cracked then. He had built a cage so complete that even the strongest spirit felt small inside it. That November, the first horrifying act took place. On a cold dark night Clement dragged Arlene to one of the cabins he had prepared. The cabin smelled of straw and damp wood. Tobias waited inside under the threat of death. The young man was trembling. His face held shame and grief. He never wanted to harm anyone, especially not the daughter of the man who owned him. But he had no choice. The world offered him none. Outside the door Clement stood like a sentinel, listening to every sound, ensuring nothing deviated from his instructions. He had scheduled every moment of that night. He had planned it according to Arlene's cycle. He believed himself efficient. He believed himself rational. No one had the courage to call him what he really was. The first result came months later. Arlene became pregnant in December. Clement greeted the news with a satisfied nod. He pulled out a notebook and marked down dates and estimates. He calculated the price the child might bring. He contacted Beauregard in New Orleans to prepare the forged papers. January brought another pregnancy. Carolyn's condition was discovered when she fainted near the staircase. Clement barely hid his excitement. Lila, too, became pregnant in February. Each pregnancy fed Clement's belief that he was on the correct path. He began speaking about the plantation's future with a tone that chilled everyone around him. Frida held out as long as she could, but by March she too was pregnant. Her young age made the process dangerous. Her body shook with weakness. She cried often, her hands pressed to her stomach as if wishing she could tear the life out before it took root. Clement ignored every plea for mercy. His mind was focused only on numbers and schedules. The house became a place of shadows. The daughters rarely left their rooms except under supervision. The windows remained locked. The doors remained bolted. The sound of keys now filled their nightmares. Dr. McCormick visited again once the pregnancies were too obvious to hide. Clement fed him a story about forbidden love between the daughters and the slaves. The doctor was shocked, but not enough to refuse the bribe. $50 a visit, more money than he had seen in months. He accepted the arrangement even as his conscience twisted in pain. He told himself he had no choice. Later he would admit that he had simply been too weak. April and May passed in misery. The women became quiet and hollow-eyed. Clement grew more demanding. He watched their diets, controlled their movements, and forced them to perform exercises he believed would improve the baby's health. Joanna lived in constant terror. She knew the truth now and knew she was powerless. June arrived with violent storms. On one of those stormy nights Arlene went into labor. Her screams filled the house. Clement delivered the baby himself with only Lila assisting. Arlene nearly died from blood loss. Clement barely looked at her. He took the newborn and carried him away like a prize. The baby was gone within 3 weeks, sold in New Orleans for $250. The second child arrived in August. Carolyn bled for hours and collapsed into unconsciousness. Her recovery was slow and full of nightmares. Her child was sold a month later. The price was higher due to his appearance. That fact brought Clement more pride than shame. Frida gave birth in October. The child came early and weak. Frida suffered injuries that would affect her for the rest of her life. Dr. McCormick voiced concern for her health but fell silent when Clement reminded him of the money. By the end of 1861, Delaney Plantation no longer felt like land. It felt like a grave. A grave where the victims were still alive. If you want, I can continue with Part 4, 1,000 words, in the same style. Part 4, The House That Started Whispering. Engaging hook. The worst horrors at Delaney Plantation did not begin with screams. They began with whispers. Soft, constant, impossible to ignore. And by the time the family realized the house itself was speaking, it was already too late. Part 4. The summer heat of 1861 weighed on Delaney Plantation like a thick blanket. Everything felt heavy and slow. The air did not move, the trees did not sway, and even the animals stayed silent as if they sensed something terrible hanging over the land. Inside the big house, the atmosphere had grown even darker. The Delaney daughters no longer looked like themselves. Their spirits had faded, their shoulders bent forward, and their eyes carried a distant emptiness that no amount of rest could fix. Arlene barely spoke anymore. Carolyn could not stop trembling. Frida had become a quiet shadow, drifting from room to room like she was lost inside her own mind. Their mother, Joanna, watched helplessly as her daughters slowly unraveled. She wanted to comfort them, but every time she came close, Clement's cold glare stopped her. His message was clear: stay silent or suffer the consequences. Joanna tried to ignore the warning, but soon she could not ignore something else. Strange things were happening inside the big house. Things that made even the bravest servants avoid the hallways after sunset. It started with footsteps. Late one night, Joanna heard slow steps moving above her bedroom. The sound was clear and heavy, like someone was pacing back and forth. She knew her daughters were asleep in the west wing. Clement was in his study. The slaves were in their quarters. The footsteps should not have been there. When she stepped into the hallway, the footsteps stopped. She waited, heart pounding, listening to the silence. Then, suddenly, she heard something even worse. A soft whisper. It sounded like a child calling her name, faint and desperate. She followed the sound to the old nursery room, a place the family had not used in years. When she opened the door, the whispering stopped. She felt a cold draft brush her cheek even though all the windows were shut. The rocking chair in the corner moved slowly, back and forth. Joanna turned away, telling herself it was her imagination, but deep down she knew the truth. Something was happening inside the house. Something not human. The strange sounds grew more frequent as the months passed. Servants reported seeing shadows move through hallways even when no one was there. Doors opened and closed by themselves. Cold spots appeared in rooms that were normally warm. One night, a slave girl named Ruth fainted after seeing a figure at the end of the hallway that she described as a woman with no face. Clement dismissed all these stories as foolish superstition, threatening to punish anyone who spread fear inside his household. But the whispers continued. What terrified Joanna most was how the whispers always happened near the girls. Arlene would sit up in bed at night, eyes wide, staring at something invisible in the corner of her room. Carolyn would cry in her sleep, calling for help, her voice filled with terror. Frida often woke with scratches on her arms as though something had grabbed her while she slept. Joanna tried to comfort them, but they were too ashamed and afraid to speak. They knew any sign of weakness would bring their father's anger. And Clement's anger had become a force everyone feared. He spent more time locked in his office, writing in his secret ledger, the pages filled with dates, numbers, and notes no one was allowed to see. He grew more paranoid and controlling. He locked doors. He kept keys on a heavy iron ring that never left his belt. He ordered the slaves to patrol the property at night. He watched his daughters like a man guarding a fortune. And then something strange happened to Clement himself. One night he woke Joanna at dawn, pale and sweating. He claimed he had heard someone walking in the hallway, but when he opened the door, no one was there. Later that week he heard crying outside his study late at night. When he checked, the hallway was empty. At first he blamed the slaves, but when he realized the sounds were coming from the walls themselves, he stopped speaking about it entirely. He started drinking heavily. He slept little. His eyes became hollow. Something was breaking inside him, though he refused to admit it. By late August, Joanna became convinced the house was reacting to what Clement had done. She remembered old stories her mother used to tell her when she was young. Stories about land absorbing pain. Stories about houses remembering suffering. Stories about spirits that refused to rest when innocent blood cried out for justice. The Delaney Plantation was now soaked with fear. And fear attracts things that feed on it. One night Joanna found Carolyn kneeling on the floor in front of her bedroom window, staring into the dark fields. Her face was calm but her voice was flat and empty when she said she had heard a baby crying outside. Joanna listened carefully but heard nothing. Carolyn insisted she had heard it. She said the voice was small and weak. She said the baby was calling for her. Joanna felt her heart drop. The thought frightened her more than anything the house had shown so far. She held Carolyn close until she fell asleep, but long after that she sat awake, staring into the same darkness her daughter had watched. What Joanna did not know was that she was not imagining things. Every night, in a room deep inside the house, Clement kept the birth certificates, the forged documents, and the records of every child taken from his daughters. The paper carried the mark of his crimes. The ink smelled of deception. The books themselves felt wrong. And the spirits connected to those stolen children had begun to stir. The plantation had become a place where suffering was forced into every wall, every floorboard, every beam. Pain had soaked into the structure like water into wood. And wood remembers. The house whispered because it knew what had been done inside it. It whispered because it was watching. It whispered because something within its walls wanted justice. Or revenge. As autumn neared, the strange activity inside the house grew stronger, darker, and more violent. The Delaney daughters sensed it first. The slaves felt it in their bones. Even the animals refused to approach the big house after sunset. But Clement ignored every sign. He believed he controlled everything. He did not realize that the house had already chosen its next victim. And this time, it was not one of the girls. It was him. Part 5. The blood in the walls. Engaging hook. People say a house cannot feel pain. They say walls cannot remember suffering. They say wood and stone cannot scream. But on Delaney Plantation in the autumn of 1861, the house had started to bleed with secrets. And those secrets were waking up. Part 5. The first real sign came in September, on a stormy morning when the sky looked bruised and heavy. Rain poured over the plantation in thick sheets, and thunder rolled across the land like distant cannon fire. At dawn, one of the slaves, Ruth, rushed into the kitchen with terror in her eyes. She asked the other servants if they had seen the red streaks on the east wall of the big house. At first they thought she meant mud. But when they stepped outside, even the bravest among them went pale. Thin lines of dark red ran down the white boards of the wall, as if something inside the house had seeped through the wood and was dripping out. Ruth said it looked like blood. The others agreed, but none of them dared speak that word in front of Clement. They wiped the wall clean as quickly as they could, praying he would not notice. But the stain returned the next morning. And the next. It became darker each time, like the house was trying harder and harder to speak. Inside the big house, tensions grew worse. Arlene barely slept. Carolyn had begun talking to herself. Frida cried without sound, her tears dropping onto the floor like fragile beads of glass. Joanna felt helpless as she watched her daughters fade into shadows. Clement ignored all of it. He refused to see the fear in his daughter's eyes. He refused to hear the whispers at night. He refused to acknowledge the red stains on the walls. He told himself he was a man of reason. He told himself ghosts were foolish nonsense. He told himself nothing could stop him. Yet even Clement could not escape the strange presence that had begun to move through the house. Late at night, when the rain hit the windows with sharp taps, he often heard someone walking in the hallway outside his study. Slow, heavy, determined, he would open the door but find nothing. He told himself it was the storm playing tricks on his ears. But each night the footsteps seemed to come closer. One night he heard a soft knock at his study door. When he opened it, no one stood there. But on the floor, he found something that made his chest tighten. A small handprint made of soot. A child's handprint, too small to belong to any adult. Too low to come from someone standing upright. It was pressed into the wood like the hand of a lost child reaching for help. He rubbed it away with anger. But the mark returned the next morning. Clement felt the house watching him. He felt its breathing in the silence. The walls seemed to pulse softly like veins. The air felt thicker, like it was slowly turning against him. Meanwhile, the daughters sensed something deeper. Arlene felt a presence near her bed each night. She said it felt like someone was gently touching her hair. Carolyn dreamed of dark rooms filled with crying infants. She would wake with her hands trembling and her heart pounding so fast she could barely breathe. Frida began hearing voices in the old nursery, tiny voices that said her name again and again. Sometimes she heard them laugh. Sometimes she heard them sob. Joanna tried to comfort her daughters, but she was drowning in her own fear. She often prayed in the empty parlor, begging God to protect her children from the evil growing inside the house. But the more she prayed, the louder the whispers became. It was as if something ancient and angry lived inside the floorboards, something that refused to stay silent. The slaves had their own stories. Lila said she saw a woman standing in the kitchen just before sunrise. The woman had no face, only darkness where her features should be. When Lila blinked, the figure was gone. Tobias reported seeing a shadow move across the yard even though the moonlight showed no one was there. Ruth refused to enter the east hallway altogether, saying she heard babies crying behind the walls. Fear moved through the plantation like a sickness. Yet Clement continued to push forward with his plan. He prepared for more children to be born. He polished his ledger each night as if it were a holy text. He traveled to New Orleans, telling traders he specialized in mixed ancestry children. His greed had grown so deep that he saw no evil in what he did. He believed he was saving his land. He believed he was controlling his destiny. But the house had other intentions. It happened one night when Clement was alone in his study. A cold wind swept through the room even though the windows were closed. His candle flickered and went out. Darkness wrapped around him like a shroud. He stood up, angry and ready to shout at whoever was in the hallway, but then he heard it. A soft cry. A baby's cry. Thin, weak, full of pain. It came from inside his office. He looked around wildly. The wail grew louder. He followed the sound to the corner where the floorboards met the wall. The crying became sharper, like the child was suffocating. Clement felt a surge of panic as he knelt to press his ear against the wall. The sound was inside the wood. Inside the house. He jerked back, shaking. For the first time in months he felt fear crawl up his spine like ice. The crying stopped. What replaced it was much worse. A whisper. Very faint, but unmistakable. Why? Clement froze. The whisper dragged out the single word like a breath that had been held too long. Why? He backed away slowly, staring at the walls as if they might move. He left the room without his candle and slammed the door shut. He told no one about the voice. He convinced himself it was exhaustion. A trick of the mind. Nothing more. But deep down he knew. The house was no longer simply whispering. It was questioning him. It was accusing him. It was gathering strength. And it wanted something. Justice. Revenge. Or perhaps something even darker. The next morning, Clement woke to find muddy footprints in the upstairs hallway. Small footprints. Child-sized. They led from the nursery to his study. The next day he found them on the stairs. The day after that they appeared outside his bedroom door. Joanna begged him to leave the plantation for a while. She said the house was sick. She said something evil had rooted itself inside the walls. But Clement refused. He told her fear made her foolish. He told her everything was under control. But that night, as he lay in bed, he felt a small hand touch his ankle. When he looked, no one was there. The Delaney plantation had finally awakened. The spirits of the lost children were no longer whispering. They were walking, and they were coming for him. If you want, I can now write. Part 6. Part 6. The Night of Whispers. Engaging hook. On Delaney Plantation, the nights had grown so quiet that even the wind seemed afraid to move. But one night, that silence finally cracked open. The house breathed in, the spirits breathed out, and the whispers became loud enough to wake the dead. Part 6. By the beginning of winter in 1861, something had changed in the air. The cold felt sharper, the shadows stretched longer, even the sunlight seemed more timid when it touched the walls of the plantation house. The servants whispered that the spirits of the unborn children had come fully awake. They said the house itself was turning against Clement. Joanna felt it most clearly. She had not slept through a full night in weeks. Every time she closed her eyes she heard a soft tapping at the window. No matter which room she slept in, the sound followed her. The tapping always came in groups of 3. And after each pause she could almost hear tiny breaths, the sort that come from frightened children trying to get someone's attention. One cold evening in December, Carolyn found her mother standing alone in the parlor, staring at the fireplace with a look of deep confusion. Joanna said she felt warmth coming from the fire even though it had burned out hours earlier. When Carolyn touched the stones of the hearth, she felt nothing but icy brick. Joanna turned to her daughter with wide eyes and whispered, "They are inside the walls. They have been trying to speak to us." Carolyn tried to comfort her, but she herself had been seeing something disturbing. Each morning when she woke, she found a small wooden toy on the foot of her bed. Sometimes it was a carved horse. Sometimes a tiny doll with no face. Sometimes a block with the letter C burned into it. The dolls were the worst. Their tiny heads twisted to the side as if someone had snapped their necks. She hid the toys in a drawer, but every morning new ones appeared. Frida suffered the most. She kept waking up with her blankets pulled tight around her neck. She said she heard children crying under the floorboards. Sometimes she heard them laugh in a way that made her heart freeze. She refused to sleep alone, but Clement insisted that she remain in her room. He said she needed discipline. Arlene tried to stay calm, but she had begun feeling a presence following her through the house. It never touched her, yet she felt watched, observed, examined, as if someone was deciding something about her. Clement refused to believe any of it. He spent most of his time in the study, drawing up estimates and writing in the ledger. He told himself his daughters were emotional. He told himself Joanna was losing her mind. He told himself ghosts were stories for weak men. But the house continued to test him. One evening he heard the sound of a baby crying from the second-floor hallway. He rushed upstairs, furious, thinking one of the slaves had brought a child into the house. But when he reached the top of the stairs, the crying stopped. The hall was empty. The lamps flickered lightly. He felt something brush past him but nothing was there. He yelled for Tobias, demanding answers. Tobias only shook his head and said, "Sir, that sound did not come from anything living." Clement slapped him for speaking nonsense. But later that night, alone in the hallway, Clement heard the cry again. This time the sound was so close that he felt warm breath against his ear. He slept with a lamp burning beside his bed after that. He would never admit it out loud, but fear had begun to creep under his skin like a slow poison. The servants knew something dark was gathering. They saw objects shift when no one touched them. They heard footsteps in rooms that were empty. Ruth swore she saw a small shape crawling across the nursery floor one early morning before sunrise. It had the size of an infant but moved with the speed of a man. When she blinked, the thing vanished. She refused to step near the nursery after that. Tobias said the animals sensed the haunting too. The horses were restless at night. The dogs refused to enter the house and would bark toward the upstairs windows with their tails tucked low. Even the birds avoided the plantation roof. In late December, on a night colder than any before, the haunting reached a new level. The evening began peacefully enough. The family gathered for dinner. The fireplace crackled, but halfway through the meal, the candles on the table flickered and went out one by one. No wind had entered the room. No servant had approached, yet each flame died gently, as if pinched by invisible fingers. The room fell into darkness. Carolyn grabbed Arlene's hand. Frida covered her ears. Joanna whispered a prayer under her breath. Then everyone heard it. Breathing. Multiple breaths. Small. Soft. Childlike. The sound came from above them. Then behind them. Then next to their chairs. Carolyn screamed as cold air brushed the back of her neck. Arlene began sobbing. Frida started shaking so violently that her chair rattled. Clement slammed his hand on the table and shouted for the servants to relight the candles. But as Tobias approached with a match, the matchstick broke in his fingers. He tried another. It snapped as well. The air felt thick, as if the room itself refused the light. Then a small voice whispered from the shadows. "We are still here." Joanna fell back in her chair, trembling. She whispered, "Oh dear God, the children. He did not let them be born. They are trapped here. Their spirits cannot find peace." Clement shouted that she was insane. But he could not hide the tremor in his voice. He stood quickly, flipping his chair over, and stormed out of the dining room. The presence seemed to follow him. The breathing grew louder in the hallway. The air turned colder. When Clement reached the bottom of the stairs, he froze. All along the walls, small handprints had appeared. Hundreds of them. They covered the wallpaper from floor to ceiling. Tiny hands pressed so hard into the walls that the prints looked bruised into the surface. Joanna saw them too and fainted. Arlene cried out. Carolyn backed away until she hit the wall. Tobias carried Joanna to the parlor while the others tried to steady their nerves. Clement stood in front of the wall of handprints like a man facing a verdict. His skin turned pale. His lips trembled. Then he shouted, "Enough!" His voice echoed through the house with a desperate power. He told the spirits to leave. He told them they had no right to haunt him. He told them he had done nothing wrong. But the whispers grew louder. All at once, every door in the hallway slammed shut with a violent force that shook the entire house. The chandelier above them swayed dangerously. The windows rattled as if something outside tried to break in. Or something inside tried to break out. Carolyn covered her ears. Arlene screamed. Tobias grabbed Frida and pulled her into the parlor. Then, just as suddenly as it began, silence fell. A deep, ancient silence that felt heavier than sound. The handprints slowly faded from the wall. The candles in the dining room flickered back to life. The air warmed again, but the family knew the truth. They had not been warned. They had been claimed. The spirits of the unborn children wanted justice. And the night of whispers had been only the beginning. Part 7, The Room Behind the Wall. Engaging hook. Some secrets stay buried for years. Others claw their way out. On the 7th night of storms, the Delaney house revealed a room that was never meant to be found. And what waited inside was not quiet. Not sleeping. Not human. Part 7. The storm arrived just after midnight, tearing across the Delaney plantation with a fury no one had expected. Rain struck the roof like stones. Wind pushed against the windows so hard the glass rattled. Thunder rolled across the sky in long, angry waves. The house moaned with every gust as if something inside it wanted to break free. Joanna lay awake in her bed, listening to the storm and praying her daughters would sleep through it. But deep down she knew the storm was more than weather. It felt like a warning. A sign. A heavy hand pounding on the door of the past. Everything had been getting worse since the night Clement disappeared. The house had grown restless. Lights flickered even when the lamps were full. Shadows stretched further than they should have. Doors breathed open and closed like lungs. The walls felt alive. Sometimes Joanna thought she heard voices speaking through the floorboards. Whispers in languages she had never heard. Cries that echoed through the night. But she kept all these thoughts locked inside her heart because she needed to stay strong for Arlene, Carolyn, and Frida. She rose quietly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and walked to the hallway. The storm wind howled through the cracks in the walls. A loud thump shook the house. Joanna jumped, gripping the railing. For a moment she thought the roof was caving in. Then she heard another sound. A voice. A girl calling for help. The voice came from downstairs. At first Joanna feared one of her daughters had wandered off, but the voice was unfamiliar. Younger. Fragile. It sounded like a child who had been waiting a long time for someone to hear her. Joanna's breath caught in her throat. She followed the voice down the staircase and into the east wing. That wing had always felt wrong. The air there was colder. The silence was deeper. Even during the day the servants avoided it. As she stepped into the hallway, a sudden gust of cold air blew out the lantern flame she carried. The darkness wrapped around her like a shroud. She wanted to turn back. She wanted to wake the girls. But the faint cry came again, soft and broken. Help me, please. Joanna forced herself forward, relying on the occasional flash of lightning to guide her. The voice grew louder as she approached the very end of the hallway, a place she almost never visited. That hallway's final corner held nothing but an empty wall, faded wallpaper, and a painting of Clement's father. But the voice was coming from behind that wall. Joanna stepped closer. She pressed her ear against the wallpaper. She expected to hear nothing. Instead she heard breathing. Slow, weak, childlike. Her heart hammered. She pulled away. Another flash of lightning illuminated the hallway. In that brief moment she saw something she had never noticed before. A thin vertical line ran down the wall. A seam, as if the wall had been built to hide something. Her hands trembled as she pressed against the seam. The wallpaper felt loose, like it had been peeled and reattached. Joanna gripped it and pulled gently. It tore away in her hands. Behind it was a wooden panel with a small keyhole. She stumbled back. She knew this house well. She knew every room, every door, every stair. Yet she had never seen this panel in her life. Help me. The voice was even clearer now. Joanna pressed her forehead against the wood, terrified and desperate. She did not have a key. She did not even know such a door existed. But she knew someone who might. 2 months ago, before he vanished, Clement kept a ring of keys on him at all times. Joanna had searched his office, his drawers, and even his hidden ledger room after he disappeared, but she had only found a few keys among his things. Tonight she remembered something else. A long, thin brass key she had found in his coat pocket. She had kept it in her jewelry box, thinking it belonged to one of his storage rooms. She had almost thrown it away. Now she felt certain that key was meant for this door. She ran back to her room, grabbed the jewelry box, and snatched the key. Her hands shook as she hurried down the hall. The storm roared louder. The house groaned as if protesting her decision. When she reached the hidden panel, she raised the lantern, relit it, and fitted the key into the lock. The moment the key turned, the hallway fell silent. The wind stopped. The thunder faded. The whispers vanished. Joanna swallowed hard and pulled the door open. A wave of cold air rushed out. It smelled of damp earth and old secrets. She stepped inside, raising the lantern. The room was small, barely the size of a closet. The walls were made of wood, stained and cracked with age. And in the center of the room was a single object. A cradle. Her breath froze in her chest. It was an old wooden cradle, painted white long ago but now darkened by time. The blanket inside was torn and stained. Joanna reached out to touch it, but before her fingers met the fabric, the crying began again. It came from the cradle. Soft, weak, painful. Joanna stumbled backward. The lantern flickered violently. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it would burst. Then the light stabilized, and she saw her. A tiny figure curled inside the cradle. A baby girl made not of flesh, but of smoke and pale glowing light. Her face flickered like a candle flame. Her eyes were dark hollows. The crying grew louder. The room temperature dropped so fast Joanna could see her breath. The child reached her trembling hands toward Joanna. "Mama!" Joanna sobbed. She could not breathe. She wanted to run but her feet refused to move. "Mama!" The crying turned into a scream. The cradle shook violently. The walls trembled. Shadows crawled toward the ceiling like dark vines. The baby's face twisted into something ancient and furious. Joanna turned to flee, but the door slammed shut behind her. The lantern went out. The room filled with cold, suffocating darkness. And the voice she heard next was not the baby's voice. It was a woman's voice. One she had not heard in years. "You left us here." Joanna screamed for help, but the storm drowned her out. Far down the hall, her daughters slept without knowing their mother had entered the room behind the wall. A room that did not let people leave. Part 8. The Whispers of the Past. Engaging hook. Some doors should never be opened. Some voices should never be heard. Joanna had stepped into a hidden room, and the past was waiting to speak. It wanted revenge. It wanted blood. And it would not be silenced. Part 8. Joanna's heart raced as the darkness pressed in around her. The lantern had died, leaving only the faint glow from the ghostly child in the cradle. She wanted to move, to escape, but the room seemed alive, holding her in place. Every step she tried to take met resistance. The floorboards creaked beneath her, but not in the usual way. They whispered secrets, murmurs of long-forgotten suffering. The baby's glow flickered and elongated, twisting like smoke into shapes Joanna could almost recognize. Faces, twisted in fear and pain, appeared in the shadows. They were the children who had been taken before, those who had vanished into Clement Delaney's plan, whose existence had been erased by forged papers and cruel hands. Joanna's mind spun. Could it be possible? Could the house remember the horror? Could it be alive with the souls of the innocent? She fell to her knees, unable to look away from the glowing cradle. The baby's voice, soft and pleading, grew louder. "Help us!" Joanna sobbed, her hands covering her face. She did not know how she could help. She had no plan. She was alone and trapped, and yet she felt a sudden clarity. This room was a witness. These voices were proof. If she could survive the night, she could expose the truth. The cradle shook violently, throwing Joanna to the ground. The ghostly infant rose, stretching its tiny arms toward the ceiling. The walls of the hidden room seemed to stretch outward, as if the house itself were expanding. Joanna realized that this was not a simple haunting. It was a message. The house was showing her the lives stolen and the horror committed within its walls. She crawled to the cradle, trembling. The glowing child reached toward her, and she felt warmth for the first time since entering the room. The faces in the shadows began to fade, their whispers turning into soft sighs. It was as if they were giving her strength, passing their courage into her hands. Joanna rose to her feet and scanned the room. She noticed small scratches on the walls, marks that had been hidden behind the wallpaper. They formed letters, words etched into wood. "Save us." Joanna's tears fell onto the floorboards. She whispered to the room, to the voices, to the ghostly child. She promised she would try. She did not know how, but she vowed to stop Clement, to save her daughters, to end the nightmare. The lantern flickered back to life, casting a weak but steady light. The baby's glow dimmed slightly, but the shadows of the lost children lingered in the corners. Joanna took a deep breath and focused. She knew that returning to the rest of the house would be dangerous. Clement could come back at any moment. He would punish her if he discovered she had found the room. Joanna backed away from the cradle and studied the walls. She noticed a small trapdoor near the floor, cleverly hidden under a rug. She knelt and opened it, revealing a narrow passage leading downward into darkness. It smelled of damp earth and old decay. The voices of the lost children grew louder from below, guiding her. With trembling hands, Joanna descended into the passage. It was tight, barely wide enough for her to move, but she pressed forward. Every step echoed through the tunnels, the sound mixing with the whispers of the past. She saw remnants of small clothing, toys, and blankets scattered along the walls, items long forgotten but preserved in the darkness. The air grew colder, and the presence of the lost souls felt heavier, almost tangible. At the end of the tunnel, Joanna entered a large, hidden cellar. The room was lined with crude wooden cribs, each containing faintly glowing figures like the baby she had seen above. They stared at her with hollow eyes, silently pleading for freedom. Joanna understood that this was the heart of Clement's atrocities, the hidden place where he had kept evidence of his crimes. She ran her hands over the cribs, recognizing the desperation and pain etched into the very wood. Some of the children's faces shifted, showing fleeting images of their lives before captivity, moments of laughter, innocence, and love stolen away by greed and cruelty. Joanna felt her stomach turn. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. She realized that if Clement found her here, the entire truth would be buried again, possibly forever. The lantern flickered again, and a soft voice whispered in her ear. Not from the children, but from somewhere deeper. It was calm, guiding her. "Release us." Joanna turned and saw a small table in the corner. On it were old ledgers, papers, and forged birth records. Each document detailed Clement's plan with terrifying precision. She recognized the names of her daughters, of Lila, and of the other women forced into the scheme. This was proof. Physical evidence that could expose the horrors of Delaney Plantation. She gathered the papers, trying to remain quiet. The glow of the children's eyes followed her, their presence urging her to act quickly. She needed to return to the big house, to protect her daughters, and to find a way to end Clement's plan. But as she turned toward the passage, she realized she was not alone. Clement Delaney stood at the top of the stairs leading into the cellar. His eyes were wide, filled with a cold, dangerous light. He had discovered her intrusion. Joanna froze. She clutched the papers to her chest. Clement's lips twisted into a smile, one that did not reach his eyes. He stepped forward, his boots echoing ominously in the cellar. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and steady. "You have no idea what you are meddling with." Joanna took a deep breath. She could not let him see her fear. She had to protect the children. She had to protect her daughters. She raised her chin, clutching the papers tighter. "I know everything," she said. "I know what you've done. I see the children. I have the proof." Clement's smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a cold rage. He stepped closer, but before he could reach her, a strange sound filled the room. The children's whispers swelled into a chorus of cries, voices rising in anger and sorrow. The lanterns flickered violently, casting shadows that danced along the walls like living figures. The floor trembled. Dust fell from the ceiling. Joanna felt the room shift beneath her feet. Clement stumbled, his face twisted in shock and fear. The children's presence became overwhelming, their combined energy pushing him backward. Joanna seized the moment. She ran up the stairs, carrying the ledgers and documents. The glow of the children faded behind her, but their whispers lingered, guiding her steps. She reached the hidden panel and pushed it closed just as the storm outside reached its peak. Breathing heavily, Joanna leaned against the wall. She had escaped the cellar, but she knew the danger was far from over. Clement Delaney had been exposed to the children's power, but he would not stop. He would come after her daughters, after anyone who threatened his plan. And Joanna understood one chilling truth. The house was alive, the children were watching, and the Delaney plantation would never be the same again. Part 9, The Fall of Delaney. Engaging hook. Some secrets refuse to stay buried. Some horrors demand reckoning. Clement Delaney had thought himself untouchable. But even the darkest men can fall. Part 9. The night air hung heavy over Delaney Plantation, thick with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. A storm had passed, leaving a silence that pressed against the windows like a living thing. Inside the big house, Joanna moved quietly, clutching the stolen ledgers to her chest. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a warning, every gust of wind a threat. She could not fail. Her daughters depended on her, and the ghosts of the children in the cellar seemed to follow her with silent judgment. Clement Delaney paced his study, unaware that Joanna had discovered the cellar and its secrets. He had sensed a shift in the household, a subtle resistance he could not identify. The pregnancies, the careful planning, and the sales had all gone according to his meticulous design. He believed he controlled everything, that no one could touch the empire he had built from cruelty. But that night, he felt the first tremor of uncertainty. The house itself seemed to whisper in corners and shadows, as if warning him that his empire was fragile. He did not know yet that the truth was about to strike. Joanna began by freeing the women in the kitchen and the house servants. Lila, whose resilience had carried her through years of abuse, was first. She clutched Joanna's hand, her face pale but determined. The other women hesitated, frightened of what Clement might do if he discovered their defiance. Joanna held the ledgers high, showing the evidence of his crimes. The women's eyes widened as they read the pages detailing the forced breeding, the forged documents, and the sales of children. This was their chance. They had to act. Together, they moved quietly through the house, unlocking doors that had kept them imprisoned for months. Frida, still weak from her last traumatic birth, leaned heavily on Lila. Arlene and Carolyn followed, their faces pale but resolute. Fear had not left them, but determination burned brighter. When Clement finally noticed the commotion, he burst from his study. His face twisted with rage as he realized what was happening. "What is the meaning of this?" he shouted. "What are you doing?" Joanna stepped forward, holding the ledgers aloft. She did not flinch. "I know everything," she said. "I have proof of your crimes. You will not harm my daughters, and you will not sell another child." Clement's eyes darted to the ledgers. A flicker of fear crossed his face, but he quickly masked it with fury. "You insolent woman," he spat. "Do you know what you are saying? This house, this land, this family, it is all mine." "It may have been yours," Joanna replied. "But the truth belongs to everyone. And the children will be free." The air seemed to tighten. The house itself groaned under the weight of history, the storm outside returning with sudden ferocity. Windows rattled, doors slammed shut, and shadows lengthened as if the walls themselves were alive. The children in the cellar had awakened, their ghostly presence growing stronger with every act of defiance. Clement lunged for Joanna, his hands grasping at her shoulders. But the house resisted him. The floors beneath his feet trembled violently, throwing him off balance. Chandeliers swayed, and a gust of wind slammed a door in his face. The whispered cries of the lost children echoed through the corridors, growing louder, almost deafening. Arlene, Carolyn, and Frida joined Joanna, standing side by side. The women had never felt such power before, yet they understood it. They were no longer victims. The spirits of those who had suffered before them were lending strength, urging them to finish what they had started. Clement staggered back, confused and terrified. The ledgers fell from Joanna's hands, spilling pages across the floor. The documents glowed faintly in the lantern light, their presence amplified by the house's restless energy. Clement realized, too late, that he had never truly controlled the plantation. The land, the house, and even the enslaved spirits belonged to no man. The women pressed forward, forcing Clement to retreat into the study. He slammed the door behind him, but the walls began to tremble, dust falling from the ceiling. Panic replaced rage in his eyes. The ledger pages seemed to move on their own, carried by some unseen force, scattering across the study. Clement lunged for them, trying to gather the evidence that would condemn him. But the house would not allow it. A heavy beam from the ceiling fell, narrowly missing him. Clement screamed, staggering backward. The spirits of the lost children appeared before him, their glowing forms shimmering like firelight in the shadows. Their faces were filled with sorrow and wrath, eyes fixed on the man who had destroyed their lives. Joanna and the women watched from the doorway, tears in their eyes, as Clement's control unraveled. He fell to his knees, clutching at the floor as if it could swallow him. No one could save him. His greed, cruelty, and obsession had summoned a force he could not fight. The storm outside reached a deafening crescendo. Rain pelted the windows, thunder shook the walls, and lightning illuminated the faces of the women and the ghosts alike. Clement Delaney's empire of horror collapsed that night, not by law or human justice, but by the reckoning of those he had wronged. By morning, the plantation was silent. Clement was gone, disappeared without a trace. Some said he had fled into the storm and never returned. Others whispered that the spirits had taken him, dragging him into the cellar to join the children whose lives he had stolen. No one knew for certain, and no one dared search. Joanna emerged from the house with her daughters and the surviving women. They had survived, but the weight of what had occurred was heavy on their hearts. The ledgers remained, scattered and open, bearing witness to the horrors that had unfolded. They were evidence, a record that could ensure Clement's deeds would never be repeated. As the sun rose over Delaney Plantation, the mist rising from the fields, Joanna looked out over the land. It was no longer just a place of suffering. It was a place of reckoning. The house had endured, and the spirits of the lost children had found peace in their justice. Joanna knew the road ahead would be difficult. The plantation's debts remained, and the social world beyond its fences would never forgive the scandal. But she also knew that she had reclaimed something more important than money or status. She had reclaimed the lives stolen, the dignity crushed, and the hope that even in the darkest places, justice could emerge. The ghosts of Delaney Plantation whispered softly around her, fading into the morning light. Joanna placed a hand on the shoulder of each of her daughters. "You are free," she said. "And so are they." And for the first time in years, the house felt alive with something other than fear. If you want, I can now create Part 10, the final climax, bringing the full story to a resolution suitable for a gripping YouTube finale. Do you want me to continue with Part 10? Part 10, Legacy of Horror and Reckoning. Engaging hook. Some horrors cannot be forgotten. Some sins demand closure. The story of Delaney Plantation ends, but its echoes will haunt forever. Part 10. The year was 1863, and the Mississippi Delta carried the thick, humid scent of earth and decay. Delaney Plantation had been silent for months, the once ominous halls now haunted not by fear, but by memory. Joanna Delaney had taken control of the estate after Clement's mysterious disappearance. Her daughters, Arlene, Carolyn, and Frida, had grown physically stronger but carried deep emotional scars, each heartbeat a reminder of the horrors they had survived. The local community whispered about the Delaney family. Some said Clement had gone mad and vanished into the swamp. Others spoke of more supernatural justice, that the spirits of the children he had sold had claimed him for their own. Nobody dared to investigate closely, and the plantation remained largely isolated. Joanna had taken immediate steps to ensure her family's safety. She had contacted distant relatives in New Orleans and arranged for trustworthy intermediaries to handle the remaining debts of the plantation. She had hidden the ledgers that documented Clement's crimes in a secret chamber beneath the floorboards of the study, determined that no trace of his atrocities would be used against them or fall into the wrong hands. But the damage had already been done. The psychological toll on the daughters was immense. Arlene often woke in the night screaming, haunted by the memories of her son she had never seen again. Carolyn wandered through the fields in silence, her mind trapped in a loop of grief and loss. Frida, the youngest, struggled to reconcile her anger and guilt with the small moments of hope that remained. Despite the darkness that lingered, life had begun to reclaim the plantation. The cotton fields, neglected for years, were once again tended with care. Joanna hired laborers and freed slaves from neighboring areas to rebuild the estate, ensuring that the cycle of exploitation would never repeat. The women found solace in the simple acts of planting, tending, and watching seedlings grow. Each new bloom in the fields became a small rebellion against the cruelty that had once ruled their lives. One spring morning, Reuben McCormick returned to the plantation. Unlike before, he came with no secrets and no payments. He walked through the fields, examining the women with genuine concern and respect. He listened to their stories, the horrors they had endured, and the courage they had shown. He documented their accounts, recognizing the historical importance of preserving the truth. Joanna realized that keeping silent about Clement's crimes could be as dangerous as his actions themselves. She decided to share the story cautiously, confiding only in those she trusted, ensuring that the horrors of Delaney Plantation would serve as a warning for generations to come. The community slowly accepted the changes at the plantation. Neighbors who had once judged or ignored the Delaneys now recognized the resilience and determination of Joanna and her daughters. Slowly, the plantation's name shifted from whispers of fear to stories of survival and courage. However, the memory of Clement's scheme lingered like a shadow. Every creak of the floorboards reminded them of the nights spent imprisoned, every old cabin in the slave quarters recalled the system of horror he had implemented. Frida often lingered at the edge of the fields, staring into the forest as if expecting to see the ghosts of those lost children return. She had learned to live with fear without letting it define her, but she knew the world outside the plantation was capable of cruelty beyond imagination. Years later, when the Civil War finally reached the region, the Delaney family found themselves spared from many of the direct horrors of battle. The war had shifted the landscape of the South, and the abolition of slavery had begun to dismantle the system that allowed men like Clement Delaney to wield such cruel power. Yet the family knew that healing from what had occurred within their walls would take far longer than any political change. The plantation eventually became a place of quiet remembrance. Joanna installed small memorials for the children who had been born and sold, for the women who had suffered, and for the men and women who had been forced into complicity. She told her daughters that remembering the past was not about dwelling in horror but honoring the resilience of those who had survived. Even as time passed, the story of Delaney Plantation became legend. Visitors would whisper about the horrors that had once occurred, about the monstrous obsession of Clement Delaney, and about the bravery of the women who had survived him. The estate served as a grim reminder of how greed and desperation could corrupt even the most familiar of places, but also how courage, love, and unity could reclaim them. In quiet moments, Joanna would sit on the porch of the big house, watching her daughters work in the fields. Each had grown stronger, more self-assured, their laughter slowly returning to fill the empty spaces once ruled by fear. They spoke often of the past, not with bitterness, but with resolve, teaching each other to find hope in the ruins Clement had left behind. The plantation remained a testament to human endurance. It was a place where horror had lived, where innocence had been stolen, and yet where survival had blossomed against all odds. Joanna and her daughters had become more than survivors, they had become keepers of a legacy, a warning and a story that must never be forgotten. And as the sun set over the fields, painting the sky with fire and gold, a strange calm settled over Delaney Plantation. It was a calm earned through suffering, through courage, and through the unbreakable bond of a family that had faced unimaginable horror and refused to be destroyed. If you have been captivated by the story of Delaney Plantation, don't forget to subscribe to Divine Deception 92 for more chilling tales from history. Share this story with friends who love suspense and history combined, and leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from and your thoughts on the courage of Joanna and her daughters. Their story deserves to be remembered.